Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Lazio, the region of Rome, for our historical region series. This is an interesting one because there is the extra challenge of telling the history of the papacy together with the one of the Roman commune and nobility and the one of the other cities. Naturally, we can't do this in depth in a single video. This is the reason why I make these videos in the first place as actual and very short debatable introductions, because at some point you can make the single history of all these elements but never looking at them in a more comprehensive way, how they interacted and so on. So I already made lots of videos about medieval papacy, about medieval Italy, central Italy. We have started, especially from the last couple of years, looking at the Italian communes in single focus. So we will continue that. But here the history is more complex. So I thought essentially to model this video on the history of the relation between the papal signory and the Roman commune and nobility, fundamentally, and of course how this affected also the control that existed, mostly of this ensemble, because they at some point they went in tandem, at other times they were even in contrast. But with the domination that the papacy and Rome built over this region, the lower Tiber Valley, basically, so founding what is the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, thus laying the foundations on the longer run of the papal states as such. Right, so we have made videos about Byzantine Italy. You know about the Roman Duchy. This was the political district of provincial scale based in Rome, so at a time which the papacy had already a consistent power in the area. Fundamentally, the church had gradually been owning all the public land, right? Here, the imperial authority is theoretically present, but it's a decentralized region from Constantinople, and of course it mostly relies on still local forces, a local militia that eventually will take over. Initially was known like the forces properly that were sent to control the city of Rome were Byzantine, but they emerge as the Militia Romanorum. I think I've never made a video about the papal army or the ones of the Roman commune, but it's actually an interesting topic because albeit we know relatively a few, however, this say constant tension between papal power, the one of the city, etc., was always present in the international scenario. At the end of the 6th century, the church already possessed in the territory roughly corresponding to today's region of Lazio, that is, in fact, a central Italian region with specific borders, but of course in medieval times they are similar but not quite the same. So these assets that were mostly landed were called the patrimonies of the church, right? The rights of sovereignty were exercised in the military circumscription of the Roman Duchy, in theory again by the Byzantine Empire, whose power in the province had declined substantially by the 8th century. This is already, like, you know, the last Byzantine emperor, Constans II, to come to Rome is in fact in the 7th century, and by that point already a substantial autonomization had taken place, right? But it's we can pinpoint some dates because some events take place, but this was a gradual dynamic. In 727, the Roman exercitus was reduced to a local armed force, essentially sustained by the essentially the same pope, interestingly enough, But you have to understand there was still a Roman Senate, right? There was a Roman nobility that, as you know, will have traditionally a great weight in the cities. Just think the power they had in the Rome in the imperial election, in the same papal one, because at the end of the day, the popes, especially at this point, came from Rome themselves, and the international prestige that they acquired accordingly, because basically the Roman factions will be key to the entire imperial policy. Historically, there were normally like two different factions, one for, I don't know, in late Carolingian times, one for the Western Franks and one for the Eastern Franks. Later you have Guelphs and Ghibellines. The Roman barons remained quite turbulent throughout basically the entire medieval history of the city. So there's really a lot there, because they, by the way, owned, as we will see now, a substantial amount of assets themselves, not just in the Roman countryside and in the city that they fortified with their own house towers, that we in part just can still admire in Rome, that however mostly, as you know, has a Renaissance phase, plus of course the ancient vestiges. But let's say there was once a medieval Rome that has very few to do with what you can see, and that at least we know archaeologically, historically, to an impressive degree, especially of military development and especially fortification of the entire city, the bridges on the river, the the general outlook of the very large urban space. Right, Rome is just a few hectares smaller than Constantinople. It was basically the largest city in the West throughout all the first half of the Middle Ages. So it was a very composite space infrastructurally. Say the Colosseum was fortified as a castle. There's really a lot of that, and if you want, I can make some videos about this too. Mervigueur, Carrocci, these are the scholars that describe this, if you're interested. But it was always a very conflictual history that we will in part look at now. So this, what I was saying, 727, the Roman exarchatus rebelled against the same Byzantine emperor, right? The exarch's authority, and thus, marking, an important step in the de facto demonstration of its own independence. At the same time, in 728, the Pope obtained from the Longobarд king Liutprand the castle of Sutri. This event is often marked as this is the beginning of the Papal States. This was actually a fortress that had already belonged to the Pope, and that during the frontier warfare against the Longobards, with whom alternating relations were occurring for reasons we can't just digress on so simply. But this is the moment in which, also before the papal call of the Franks, the Longobards were pushing for taking over Rome, inside of which there was a pro-Longobard faction, and that would have naturally made the papacy continue as always. That there is no contrast in that sense, but things could have really gone in another direction. In any case, this castle was simply rendered back to the papacy, and given the formality of the agreement of Sutri, this stands out like at least the first instance of another power other than at least the forgery of Constantine's donation, conferred to the actual church, right, to Saint Peter, a secular possession. This is particularly important because at least the entire investiture controversy will be based on the same ambiguity. I made lots of videos about the Renovatio Imperii, the same investiture struggle, and so on. So if you want a topic that I will come back on to actually explain what was actually the patrimonium from a, say, juridical, political, and even theological point of view, how it related itself with in fact, lay power and secular power, given that it was being exercised by the same church, which is a very important thing. It does not belong to this world. Remember that. So, in as much as it was a papal possession, it had to remain untouched, right? But the point was also, in which dimension are we talking about? Is here the Pope just a secular lord, or his material possessions entail something else? This is completely unrelated, but we have this kind of agreements continuing. For example, Pope Zachary obtained some, among other lands, with the agreement of Terni in 742, towns like Ameria, Orte, Polimarzo, and Blera. These are all Latial cities, so we have to get acquainted, perhaps, now a bit about the various sub-provinces of this area. There would be also a long and very interesting history of the monastic foundations. Think about Monte Cassino or Farfa, etc. So those are in Lazio, but for today we follow just the essentials of this papal Roman issues. So all these agreements were also called restitutions because they implied not just the fact that these territories had once belonged already to the Pope, but that papal power was being accentuated on the returned lands, right? And in general, officially attributed to it that political character that the trip of Pope Stephen II to Francia, the achievement of fiscal autonomy, and the donation of Pippin definitely recognized, right? When the Franks were called to, let's say, save the papacy from the Longobards, it was properly stated, right? It was an early agreement between the Franks and the papacy that the latter should have basically owned, from a political and territorial point of view, all of Italy up to the Adige River in the north. So we are even beyond the Po River and the Strait of Messina in the south. And this was just an initial, okay, let's simply do it because we will not know what will happen, right, from a Carolingian perspective, like before entering Italy and taking over the Longobard kingdom. But the church took this quite seriously. From another point of view, it was the metropolitic boundaries of Rome that naturally had, namely, a great authority over most of Italy. Considered that the papacy had always maintained large estates in southern Italy, especially, and in Sicily, so much so that the loss of the latter, when the Arabs conquered from the Byzantines, brought to a shrinking, actually, of the international profile of the papacy into something more strictly Italic in nature. We will see it perhaps in another video. In any case, the compaction of a political territorial power radiating from Rome here has begun, right? Admittedly, the Pope does not control a large area. Actually, Lazio is the only province over which, through the militia of the city of Rome, the Pope can extend a substantial control also over other towns. Rome is big, it is active, it is tumultuous, unruly, right? But it has also, for this reason, ambitions on her own as a city over the other ones in the surroundings. And you understand how this mechanism worked throughout all the Middle Ages. Essentially, some raids from Rome to tame this or that town, to get tributes, and so on. But as far as the papacy is concerned, the so-called Sancta Res Publica had been born, de facto. These struggles between the local autonomous elements and, let's say, the concise will of central power began together with it, because now the papacy could simply start extending its control through these pre-existing institutions. And the clash is revealed with regard to especially the domus culte, that is to say, basically latifundia, right? These were large estates that had remained relatively standing in Byzantine Italy, even though they had already gone through a process of parcelization, not too distant from what had happened in the Longobard part of the peninsula, that however were largely owned by the same church, that practiced very convenient land exploitation through contracts known as the emphithouses. That is to say, basically they had so much land, basically every single inch of land in Rome and around it belonged to the church. So the papacy, nor basically anyone, in spite of the power of the local nobility, had the capacity of simply controlling this entire space. Just in theory, if you had settled there, at some point the state could say, well, look, this in theory is mine. It's a bit like in Roman times, right? And essentially negotiating the price, the canon, over this land. The emphithouses were long-term contracts, like 99 years, over several generations, as you understand. After which you basically left this families working on the land, and eventually the church had to come back, like say, in full disposal of what remained her property anyway, to renegotiate the contract, and so just updating it to the current market situation. Very convenient. The domus culte, with the rise of papal power, were improved further. For example, the Saint Zachary and Hadrian I, so here we are in full Carolingian time, had organized them in large numbers in the countryside. They served as a support framework for the lordship of the church on the territory, and also as a starting point for further expansion at the expense of other people's property, right? That is to say, not differently from what was happening basically in all the rest of Europe in terms of the affirmation of essentially a nobility, even beyond an aristocracy. Think about the Carolingian Empire. Surely the Frankish influence had accelerated this phenomenon as well, because everything was turning somehow feudal in nature. Simultaneously with the monastic development of the 8th and the 9th century, that also goes in parallel with Carolingian times, and as you know, Rome, the papacy, her classical imperial Roman legacy in the first place, enormously contributed to the development of monasticism all over Europe, right? All the various missions were regulated from Rome in coordination with the Franks. There was already the start of that kind of centralized supervision that was putting Rome at the center of Western spirituality. By this point, the Visigoths had been taken over by the Arabs, so the only place would have been the councils of Toledo that had somehow escaped a bit the development of a rite accepted basically from the same Rome, had been actually even taken back by the same Rome, because when the Asturias began to resist the Arabs, etc., Rome began to send help economically and militarily with the Franks in exchange for the recognition of the Roman right over the previous Visigothic one, that had, by the way, also harbored substantial heresies such as adoptionism, things like this. In any case, the preeminence of Rome in Western spirituality had been continuous since imperial times. Just think about even before these events, the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons at the time of Gregory the Great, just the axis that had been forming with the pilgrimage routes, etc., between Rome, France, England, the rivalry, but still essentially the connection also with the metropolitic sees of Ravenna and of Milan. So at this time we are actually relatively distant from the Gregorian reforms and papal monarchy that will fully and formally affirm the preeminence of the Holy See. But the foundations are obviously laid, right? Rome was, again, by far the most active, radiating, influencing center in Western Europe, and all these events, right, are connected with that, obviously. Now, the lay families, right? We already mentioned them in Rome at this time, early medieval, high medieval. They occupy the city offices that had remained. There is a Roman Senate again. There are some, activities such as the Xenodochia for the pilgrims, for the foreigners, that are run by the papacy. So with pious foundations of just the massive landed assets of the same church. The lay government of the city is present as well. It regulates other aspects. There is a police. There is a general, as we have seen, protection of the same papacy. So all things that would be extremely interesting to delve in detail, in depth. And again, I promise on the longer run, we arrive to that. By the way, you know that I created a sort of touristic playlist that talks specifically about the history of the herbs throughout the eras. So this will not likely go into it because it's part of another series, but there is a lot about medieval Rome on Schwerpunkt. The lay nobility is pretty aggressive as well. In the countryside, they infiltrate the clusters, they take possession of the abbacies. They lord over other cities together with the Bishop of Rome, which, as we've seen, is now a powerful landlord. So this is a very important aspect. Papal and Roman noble policy go largely in parallel, or at least they're also in function of one another, right? Sometimes even conflictually, as we will see. But again, the extension of a Roman dominion over other towns in the surrounding area is quite important. The most important cities at that time were, also because they were more numerous, were in the so-called area of Campagna e Marittima, which is essentially in the south of Rome, referring specifically to the countryside and the coastal strip, respectively. These were areas that, from ancient times, connected the Latium with Campania, so they were quite rich agricultural areas. In the Middle Ages, as you know, you have a switch. Let's say that the most developed areas of ancient times in the peninsula were the center and the south. Now the thing is switching to the center and the north, right? So in early high medieval times, the southern connections are really important, also because consider that we're not yet in Norman times, so southern Italy has not been compacted under a single rule. And the papacy is trying to control all the various dioceses of the region. There are really a lot, right? We're talking about very southern Italy, not here. That is in the surroundings of Rome. But this lands form as a land bridge, right? That is quite crucial in the relation with the Longobards, the Byzantines, and the same Franks. Right, because the frontier area south of Rome is just like a mess where lots of actors can play, right? By the way, the Roman countryside changes because after the defeat of the Saracens that were dislodged militarily from the mouth of the Garigliano River in the south of Rome, with an alliance that included the papacy, some maritime republics, some Italic, the nobility of the Italic kingdom, even the Byzantines. Basically, the larger, this is a phenomenon studied especially by Toubert, phenomenon of castellation really starts, right? At the end of these raids that had struck even the same basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, in the very Rome, the Leonine wall it starts being built at that point, right? So there is all a process of urbanistic development accordingly. This is the city where the Western emperors are crowned now. That there is an inflating international, universal dimension from Rome. But finally, there is a moment of greater stability that is exploited by the Roman nobility to entrench in the countryside, to build massive fortresses from which they could rule over the surrounding countryside. That is fairly fertile. I mean, the lower Tiber Valley is quite, is prosperous, at least agriculturally speaking. The high medieval economy is crucially based on it. And the rising price of land contributes to the wealth of the large landowners that in some cases replace part of the older nobility. So forming not just new groups, but spreading also a sort of local aristocracy in other parts of Lazio. They are the domains in which the Pope will lean against the nobility during the investiture controversy. And at the end of the 11th century, even more in the 12th, the popes give themselves with energy to reorganize their dominion, endangered by instability due to this uncontrolled flourishing of the local aristocracy. Calixtus II in 1120 moves with arms against Arnaria and Ticena. Honorius II takes possession of Segni, Trevi, and Mayenza between 1125 and 1126. Also, he destroys with fire Posterzo, Roccasecca, Giuliano, St. Stephen, Prosedi. Eugene III recovers Terracina, Sezze, Norma, and Fumone in the south. This process is, as you understood, fueled just by the further compaction of the papal lordship over Rome, but also the possibility of the availability of men and material, right? The will of the Roman community to extend their power over the surrounding centers. As in northern Italy, so also in Lazio, the communes and the Pope assisted each other in the name of mutual interests. Right? It's very important to remember that Rome was a commune at a point, like all the others. Right? Of course, you cannot be quite exactly like all the others because you have the Pope inside the walls and controlling, as we've seen, also much outside of them. But the forms of political and institutional organization are pretty much the same. The only problem being that too much representation and liberty go against what is profiling itself with the Gregorian forms as a papal monarchy, right? So an enormous apparatus that, again, had already taken de facto an ecumenic scale was able to see itself universally dictating, literally, think about the Dictatus Papae, conditions to imperial rule, so something that couldn't quite go in parallel simply to a de facto independent communal power like you could find in other parts of central and northern Italy. There is all, as we will see now, that the boundaries are still, let's say, of papal control are still limited to Lazio per se, which doesn't mean that the pontiffs control literally the entire region. As a matter of fact, the process of consolidation in it was, in terms of direct government, was taking place just now. You had to create essentially a settled apparatus ex novo, right, to control all towns that were habituated to, of course, recognize the papacy and Roman power just in a sort of as a sort of overlordship, but not quite to be directly controlled, right? So just think, and that's why this history is so messed up, because all the nobility of Rome had already infiltrated those towns, and so there were groups that were rowing backwards, trying to maintain their own autonomy, and then the popes were elected, so you could have from a pope to another like a completely different policy regarding this factions. We're not talking about what was going on in general. I mean, at some point Rome is sacked by the Normans that had in theory come to help the papacy from Henry IV that had occupied the city. You have really lots of stuff going on. We will see it better at some point. Rome, however, still cumulates her prestige. Only the commune struggles to affirm its forms in a more substantial and codified way, because of the weight of the papacy and the Roman barons that are pretty violent people, telling the truth, and very aware of their role as tip of the balance internationally. So they would pursue some of the shrewdest policies in here. In any case, we are 11th to 12th century, like the taking off of Western Europe under so many levels. So the same Rome is injected further blood in our veins from the countryside, from the same city, and more. All right. We have the same effort exerted, by the way, by the mean of local forces, right? It is difficult to expand in the countryside. Remember, this is one of the single most, say, urban, at least there is a massive fortified net here, right? Even though it's not comparable to the one already of northern Italy, still Latium had hosted the backyard of the Roman emperors. So all these various cities scattered on the hilltops, very really articulated territory politically, are putting up an atrocious resistance. The papal control on the the popes are also floating over Rome, right? They start building some residences in the other towns they conquered, because very often Rome was dangerous herself. I made a video about this on the tumultuous nature of the urbs, and so all these various papal residences that looked like that are castles, right? They're palaces, but they're built with a massive amount of stone. For this times, it's also again in the area. Much also the classical vestiges were available for as caves of material, let's put it in this way. So it's really a very harsh situation where the Pope has finally won with the Concordat of Worms the investiture controversy. The Roman Pontiff basically now has the right of prelection of the Italian bishops, whereas the Germanic ruler has in Germany. In any case, there are still universal authorities that fundamentally have to confirm, hopefully, the choice of the choice of the other for this episcopal appointments. and the city itself in the moment in which it grows becomes insecure. The barons can put up major riots and more. The same processions of the Pope from, say, St. John to St. Peter can be a risky path, right? The entire urban landscape is fortified. So the Pope also needs external help in order to consolidate power locally, because alone doesn't matter that he's actually the greatest spiritual force in the West, and that lots of money starts coming in his coffers. There is no fully stable political territorial rule, right? Alexander III, for example, benefits from the Normans to subjugate Lazio, right? The Normans had somehow rough times with the papacy early in the day, but fundamentally they even captured Leo IX at the Battle of Civitate, famously enough, where the papal army was made up of Romans, Longobards, Swabians, but after that they realized that a coexistence is better. Actually, the papacy benefits from enfeoffing the Normans in southern Italy and also launching the crusade towards Sicily. At this point, naturally, the papacy can summon its own divisions, right? At least before the great princes of Europe will realize that, being involved in their petty quarrels means also to lose the opportunity of leading these major expeditions in the Near East, controlling the end of the Silk Route there and so on. In any case, the recompaction of southern Italy and the reconquest of Sicily allow the papacy to regain lots of its previous possessions, because the Sicilian church has very specific ties with the papacy, as much as the Hauteville monarchy does in function of the fact that they're actually vassals of the papacy, right? And this connection is quite strong. There are some enclaves, such as Benevent, right, capital of the previous Longobard Duchy, that had granted themselves to the papal states that are being born, rather than being ruled by the Normans. So there is a lot now that can be agglomerated, let's say, locally in Rome to eventually consolidate, right, to spend in terms of resources to subjugate other centers around Rome, right? Alexander III's vicar John tamed the rebel Sabina area, that is just basically in the northeast of Rome, in 1165. Then there is the Peace of Venice in 1177 that sees, as you know, essentially the victory of the Lombard League over Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, that sets this is the prelude to Constance 6 years later, but it's at least when the war was over, and this naturally is a papal victory, because the Lombard League was sponsored and backed by the papacy against the excommunicated emperor, and the Arch-Chancellor of the Empire, Christian of Mainz, came to lend a hand to the Pope against the Roman rebels, and the one of the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, as a sign of reconciliation with the Church, obviously to get some further help for the Hohenstaufen that now had to restabilize after the blow of Legnano. Made a video about that. A very important event in those previous generations had been the Roman uprising of 1143. This had to do with a lot of spiritual issues, but also very concretely political one. You have surely heard of Arnold of Brescia. I made a video about him. He's one of the most famous heretics of the 12th century, who staged basically this revolt in Rome, or at least was used as the charismatic spiritual leader. This is the age of heresies. The Pope flees Rome because the local commune factually expels him, and Frederick Barbarossa comes to Italy in his first expedition, yes, to tame Milan that was expanding against her neighbors, but also to bring the Pope back to Rome. And on that occasion, he sets things right in that regard. But the fact that the Roman commune had expelled the Pope tells you how powerful the city of Rome actually was during the 12th century. Such revolts had brought to the so-called Renovatio Senatus, that is a definition, a better definition at least, of the Roman communal prerogatives. There were some senators basically at the head of this communal government that were very often the same barons that wanted to naturally negotiate more power with the papacy. And this constitution served to keep the elements of the city government united, right? Even amidst the contrasts of the factions. This is, very similar to some dynamics that occur in the rest of the Italian communes, essentially giving them new unity of purpose regarding the conquest of the Roman territory, and a more defined position of competition with respect to the pontifical authority. That is to say, this is not just about an eternal game with the Pope, but it has to do with the actual liberty of the Roman people to conquer other communes, right? Just like the most successful ones in the rest of Italy were doing. And the Pope, naturally, doesn't have all the interest for this to happen. As we will see, an interesting dynamic is formed. That is to say, the Pope is conferred power by some of these towns around Rome to prevent the conquest, which will, generally speaking, help the papacy to grow to such a great power by the end of the late Middle Ages to take over everyone, right? But essentially choking the Roman commune, or at least preventing it from developing that centralized level of institutions that will characterize especially the 13th, the 14th century in other great communes. So against this strong nucleus of resistance represented by the Roman commune, Alexander III's methods could have no lasting effect, for the aforementioned reason that this still the papal condition was not one of a major power in Europe, like, I don't know, France, England, Castile, whatever. Like, this was not like a kingdom, a firmly established territorial reality. It was just the Pope with an incredible function throughout the whole continent, but that did not include the establishment of properly an imperial dimension just per se, and that was challenged by these actors locally, of course. There was a reaction of the Romans against the neighboring town of Albano that was destroyed in 1168. There are also the devastations of the territories of Tusculum and other centers of Lazio in 1184, and the generally bad relations of the urbs with the successors of Alexander III that proved that the Roman commune had grown to a dramatic degree, in spite of the break that these other elements managed to stem in a way. If we look at Clement III, we see other issues at this point. There is a further consolidation of the Haute-Ville in Sicily that managed to also regulate further the church, which is something that, as we've seen, the papacy had tried to avoid. And the Pope concludes himself an agreement with the Saint Commune of Rome, assuring thus him in this delicate international circumstance the loyalty of the Roman Senate and the use, in fact, of the city militias that, as we've seen, were tempered by a significant time of military expeditions and so on. In 1198, the Roman Senate fell, however, even more under the papal authority because of the pontificate of Innocent III, who was actually from the family, the Counts of Segni, the same Latial background. Because again, these popes are mostly Roman themselves. Innocent III embodies the peak of Roman Catholic power. During the Middle Ages, he received at that point basically the vassalage of almost every sovereign in Europe, and succeeded clamorously. Like, think about the Battle of Las Navas, the Fourth Crusade. I mean, this is the moment of radically exponential consolidation of the papal monarchy to an unprecedented extent of fame, power, and wealth. That really is in great part merit of this single man. I made multiple videos about Innocent III because it was actually a difficult situation, the one he found when he rose to power, but he managed to score all these results. So much so that Innocent made his claims on the goods of the Roman territory his own. In other words, what the Roman commune could harvest, let's say, from the surrounding towns, now was being managed by the Pope. An immense amount of local wealth. The feudal lords of Campania, of Marittima, and Tuscia, that is in the north of Rome. Actually, it's the same etymology of Tuscany, right? But Tuscany is at least something separated, because technically, I discussed this in the video about medieval Siena. Part of Tuscany, including Siena at that point, was thought to be part of still a direct papal control, because of the boundaries of the Metropolitic See of Rome, but papal control didn't arrive so far. But in the north of Rome, you have especially the city of Viterbo, and that is the capital of Tuscia, that was bound at this point to the Roman Senate with the obligation of tribute and vassalage. Right. This also shows the reach. They're not great, enormous distances, but they still show that the Roman army could launch these expeditions in taming even the largest cities in Lazio. The succession of Riccardo dei Conti, that is Innocent III's brother, in the 9 castles in Lazio and Sabina, border formerly of belonging to the Poli family, created essentially a family lordship of the Pope, right, of the Counts of Segni. Innocent III therefore won, and even the popular party, which in Rome was at this moment hostile to the pontiff, did not seem to be feared, right? The Roman people was mostly, like in all these communes, there was an elite made up by the knights. Fundamentally, they were the barons, right, and the most, in fact, the military class. Then there were the peditas, the populace, essentially the commoners, that in all this were gradually losing their own power, but that in their quarters were, and especially in the narrow city streets, were some of the single most radically violent and uncontrollable communities in medieval Europe, right? They managed to dislodge entire armies, right, naturally with the support also of the barons, and aid from their possessions out of Rome. But again, controlling Rome in a direct sense, by this point, was a chimera. But to so much power, Innocent III had ascended. The General Parliament of Viterbo in 1207, summoned by the same Pope to increase the authority of the papal rectors, signaled the consolidation of a power that essentially went beyond factional interest per se, because the latter had been now put down by this incredible authority. The Latial provinces became now, and even more with Gregory X, well, between 1271 and 1276, the set of lands subject to the papal rector, right? That, in other words, was a sort of lord, right, that arbitrated over the local councils, customs, and so on, right? You have something similar in other areas of Italy, as we will see now that the Angevins do something as proto-lords of certain cities. And among these Latial provinces, the patrimony, because that's how the papal possession there was called, of Tuscia, received the first order from Innocent III. The rector, when he did not receive express limitation, had the sum of essentially sovereign power, which, due to the spiritual nature of the papal authority and to the support of local autonomies, was thus decentralized in the provinces. Meaning that, of course, also these rectors, yes, on paper, had this sort of autocratic. They acted literally on behalf of the Pope, who is acting exactly on behalf of God as Christ's vicar on earth himself, right? So there is all a powerful juridical, theological theory behind this. The papacy is skyrocketing also in terms of legal production. We've seen canon law, the decretals, made lots of videos about that. So bear in mind that between Rome, Paris, Naples, at this point, the papal Angevin axis is producing what is literal modern bureaucracy, right? It wasn't born in the 18th century. It was born in the 13th century, in the peak of wealth power in southwestern Europe. The general parliaments were instead rare, because the directors mostly worked by themselves, of course, referring to the Pope. And again, they had their own problems as well, because they weren't de facto omnipowerful. But at this point, this settlement, for which from Rome the papacy controls all these various surrounding provinces in Lazio, is established. Most of the parliaments held at this point were provincial, that is, also summoned and presided over by the rector himself in the relative province. And their life was ancient, right? We know some of them starting from the 11th to 12th century. However, at this point, even if we cannot yet, of course, speak of parliament as a definitely ordered institution in the state, the power attributed to these meetings, especially to resist the unjust claims of the rector, made the parliament a supervisory organ of the Pope himself, and in this way transformed more and more into an organ state of the administration. You understand how the thing worked. Like, the Pope could play on different levels of the hierarchy to, at the end of the day, act as an overlord, right? In fact, the Pope was the only judge of the conflict between the Parliament and the rector, right? The local elements always ending up being reduced to the authority of the Church, right? By now, the papal monarchy has really consolidated, and these territories fall under, her rule directly. The internal reorganization was completed by the delimitation of the external boundaries of the state of the church that were made an imperial matter, because of course, as we were saying before, an actual land that had not to be controlled by literally by anyone else, so the other authority was the emperor, was fixed, was delimited at Neuss on June the 8th in 1201, and at Speyer on March the 22nd, 1209. Right, these were delicate moments in which Innocent III had been negotiating with Otto IV after having adopted Frederick II. So in this quite crucial moment, let's say, between Germany, Sicily, France, England, the papacy, for all these countries to take different direction, that was mostly determined at Bouvines, as I made a couple of videos on this topic. The arrogance of Otto IV, that had basically promised to never rejoin Sicily and Italy and Germany in exchange of the recognition of his imperial crown, was manifested in the same Lazio, because the guy came to Sicily, so passing through the Papal States, seizing towns like Montefiascone, Acquapendente, Viterbo, Radicofani, and others. In all this, of course, there was some local support, because the Guelphs and the Ghibellines were taking form factionally at a local level. So Otto IV was, of course, excommunicated. He failed to affirm himself both in Italy and in Germany, so that at Bouvines actually he had a very few, like mostly he had English mercenaries from his side rather than Germans, if not those who had just immediate grievances against the King of France. In any case, after Otto's demise, these boundaries of the church were confirmed and issued by Frederick II to Honorius III, right? This was a very important passage, because Frederick II had been raised as a perfect child of the church, and as you know, as the future Holy Roman Emperor, he had to, in this sense, behave in a way that wouldn't make the church feeling essentially taken in a pincer movement between Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Innocentian policy would set a bit the standards of the papal one in the century to come, right? That this had been the most clamorously powerful and successful pope in the last centuries, and again, in absolute terms, to a larger degree in terms of this political and territorial capacity. So much so that the same policy showed her decisive effects on the same pontiff's position as a territorial lord from there on, even if the Roman Senate and the Pope still entered into conflict, such as in 1229, during the struggle between Gregory IX and Frederick II, also because there was an actual war there going on between the Papal States and Sicily. And if the Roman Senate expressed the will to continue the subjection of Tuscia and Lazio on its own account, with the expedition up to Montefortino and at Anagni in 1232, the Pope was no longer totally cut off from city politics, right? During all these disturbances, again, he could simply remain in another city. Like the Pope from the 12th century basically was mostly living in some other city in Lazio rather than Rome. It was much safer, also just healthier, given the illnesses, malaria, like stuff that could arise from the swamps. Consider that the Tiber River didn't have the banks built so regularly. Parts of the city were flooded, right? And summers were pretty hard there. However, the papal presence in Rome was by now like paradigmatic, so much so that in 1232 the Pope was indeed invited to return to Rome, also because the city would still benefit to a degree, at least, the presence of the papal curia meant like justify all the expenses of the cardinals, all jobs, all money for the city, etc. And obviously Rome was the larger city. Keeping the Pope away was just giving other further power to the other surrounding towns. So there were pretty contingent reasons, both locally, regionally, internationally, for all these things to happen. But you wanted also to play your cards, in fact, accordingly. In part, the situation prior to Innocent III was renewed. The interests of the free cities such as Viterbo and Corneto in Tuscia, Tivoli and Velletri, Terracina and Anagni in Campania, despite internal hostilities against the privileges of the clergy that was ever more hierarchically structured, coincided with those of the pontiff against the aims of the Roman commune. Right? Again, remember here, the commune is boxed in this space for which he would like to expand against all these other towns, but the Pope has basically made them their own, to the point that, especially as when he was in Rome, he would be backed by them not to move again back to them, and so being more directly ruled by him in the process. But all those who are under him are, in this sense, gradually weakening in relative terms, because they are ever more dependent on him. Rome's natural enemy was also the feudal nobility of the provinces, both because of papal investiture and because they coveted the purchase of cities. So in other words, there were noblemen who had in all this maintained their assets in other centers. The most powerful Roman barons had, of course, possessions not just in the countryside but in this very cities. So the Roman commune was mostly made up or rendered possible by the popular support, and if the barons could simply rule elsewhere as sort of feudal lords and in part obstacle the same commune, preventing the city from taking over those possessions, because there was this tension between the milites and the pedites in part as well, in spite of the vertical connivences that were the most important. That could at least stem communal power. The events of 1234 especially clear the attempt of Rome to dislodge the papacy failed. The Roman senator Luca Savelli, from one of the single most noble families of Rome, fought in Tuscia and in Campania, but was factually defeated by the offensive, the counteroffensive of his foes, right? That were quite strongly based in the strongholds of Radicofani, Montefiascone, and above all Viterbo, and also the imperial aid that at that point, despite of the back and forth of, say, the relations with Frederick II, had been provided. As a consequence, in 1235, the Pope recovered Sabina, Tuscia, and received the homage of the Roman Senate. It was over. This was basically a major turning point in the relations with the city. At some point, the papacy also exploited the metus hostilis, the fact that these latial centers were, in a sense, had been struggling for their own liberty, still made them wary of the possible external threats. In fact, while at that point there were some Ghibellines who supported Frederick, in fact, when the emperor invaded Sabina and Tuscia, Viterbo, Corneto, and the Ghibelline faction of Tivoli supported him, together destroying Albano in May 1243. The local Ghibelline party wasn't strengthened by these actions, right? Actually, they fell in disrepute, giving prevalence to the already very powerful opponents that, on the death of Celestine IV, triumphed in Rome with the election of Matteo Rosso Orsini as senator. This dynamic is understandable. Basically, these guys had been working as sort of a Trojan horse in Lazio, and in a region that would have hosted the papacy anyway. Admittedly, yes, they were fighting against him with the support of the emperor, so in theory, right, there could be an imperial victory and think, but what were the odds, really? As a consequence, the Orsini here prevailed. The Matteo Rosso becomes a Roman senator, so becoming the most important lay figure in the urbs, and the Orsini were traditionally wealth, that is, supporting / being supported by the papacy. Not always, right? The other famous name is the Colonna, that were Ghibellines. At times they fought against one another, against the papacy as well, so nothing so directly obvious in alliances, in interest, and so on. But this wealth affirmation in the city was also overlapping with the further strengthening of papal power. When Frederick II died in 1250, it was seen that the will to dominate the Roman commune served practically no other purpose than to rally all the provincial forces around the Pope. Right, so at that point, even the city factions decided that it was better at least to develop their own local institutions, say, within the city, and not trying to, let's say, extend some other capacity outside the city walls, trying to, say, just survive in the situation. Innocent IV had, from his side at this point, together with the latial towns, also the strongest families in Rome: the Colonna, the Orsini, the Sabelli, the Conti, the Annibaldi, the Frangipani, and the Capocci. Under Urban IV, the local forces of Lazio generally opposed Manfred of Swabia because they were wealth. And at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, when Charles of Anjou finally ensured himself, after having already crushed Manfred 2 years before, essentially the hegemony over the Italian peninsula, beheading also the last of the Hohenstaufen, the young Conradin, the papal party was, to the stars. I did make a video about Manfred of Swabia, Manfred of Sicily, that is one of the single most important figures in the Western Middle Ages, but people fundamentally ignore this aspect. And regarding Rome, there is much to say because the papacy never really recognized him, and he played his cards against it. But the crusade of Charles of Anjou against Manfred was really a big gamble. Right, fighting against him and eventually against Coradin had been a risky business also for the papacy. In 1267, in fact, the pontiff had to flee Rome, right, as there had been a popular turmoil which eventually brought to power the Capocci and Henry of Castile at the passage of the army of Coradin from the north, right? So this was actually a major promise, at least for the Ghibelline party, because if Charles of Anjou had been defeated, as he was almost, right, at Tagliacozzo, the entire history of the West would have been significantly different by that point. Also, the Imperials had subjugated the countryside, but after they lost and the St. Coradin was captured, everything reverted back as it was. Naturally, there were problems with the same Angevins installed in southern Italy. Right. First of all, we are at the end of the 13th century. The decline of the empire, the decline of the papacy, bring to a further a localization of power. Right. This is why we're still at the peak. Right. We realized there was a stagnation, not quite the fall of the break of the mid 14th century. But it's in this time that we can appreciate the more decisive physiognomy that the papal temporal power took, so that we finally see the Patrimonium Sancti Petri established as a more concrete regional political expression. This, however, meant that the papacy was relatively more, vulnerable, at least to a specific damage to that territory. The Angevins in Naples were allies of the Pope, but they began to pressure as well, because they had they were lightly handed on central northern Italy as a whole. They just, however, because of this reason, recognized as lords or crypto lords of most communes. They distributed some garrisons here and there, and they took on an important part of the military expenses, because just Sicily here was an incredible amount of wealth on its own. Plus, this were the Capetians, just backed by the entire Kingdom of France. So it's a huge deal, really. They're working in tandem with the papacy, but Charles of Anjou behaves in a sort of not bullying fashion, but still becoming also the Roman senator, so having a clear interest, right, even in shifting the capital from Sicily to Naples, in that Roman proximity. At this point, at the election of Gregory X in 1272, the Sicilian pressure was becoming encumbrant, so that the papacy made finally an agreement with Rudolf of Habsburg, supporting his rise to the crown, to the throne of Germany and the crown of the Romans, which was a big deal, because the German power had essentially been fragmented ever since at the end of the Hohenstaufen. It had been greatly reduced, so now it was excessively so. So the papacy decided to back this candidate that was extremely successful in crushing, as you know, the Bohemians that were allied with with Charles of Anjou. And in exchange, of course, given that the king of the Romans represented still the Germanic imperial power, even though Rudolf was never crowned as emperor because he never came to Rome. The papacy was recognized the possessions in the Romagnol area in the north that would thus be encompassed in the papal states. Also some other territories, for example, Bologna, right? So centers of great international importance that had been fought over by the papacy and the empire for centuries, right? And there had always been this great problem. They wouldn't affect Lazio because this was the innermost part of the papal states, was already under papal control, as we've seen. But say by the end of the 13th century, you have this papal path opening also towards further north that wouldn't be controlled until very late in times, the Renaissance. But that still was considered now more directly manageable, right? On May the 4th, 1278, Rudolf renewed the Treaties of Lausanne for Nicholas III, which confirmed this situation. On July the 18th, 1278, so you understand a few months later, it's not a coincidence, a pontifical constitution excluded foreigners from public offices in Rome, including Charles of Anjou, right? So re-establishing in the process also the papal control over the Roman public offices, which meant a further affirmation over the Roman nobility. You understand how successfully shrewd papal policy really was. Finally, the peace between Rudolf of Habsburg and Charles of Anjou in 1280 concluded under the auspices of the Pope, removed the pretexts for the internal struggles and foreign aid for the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in Rome herself. Right, these two rulers had even hoped to create a sort of dynastic connection between the two houses, but the thing shipwrecked eventually. The papacy managed to keep this to the theaters orderly and avoiding further interference in the Roman affairs. Right, so at this point, the Pope can truly be called a monarch because his way of ruling is de facto corresponding fully to one, right? The policy favorable to the formation of the princely power of the same papal, the same family of the Pope, right, undertaken by Innocent III, as we have seen, was resumed. Unsurprisingly, at this point, by the same Nicholas III, with the concession of the castle of Soriano to his brother Orso. And this was a way, naturally, to just even through single private families to make whomever would have been raised to Peter's soil just more powerful on his own. Of course, a lot of private assets, as we've seen, had always been at the base of any power, the papal one, the imperial one, etc. A brief deviation from Nicholas III's policy made by Martin the Fourth occurred when Charles of Anjou was made again a Roman senator. The Angevin count was an Angevin count was installed in Tivoli, just near Rome, and also Charles Vickers in Barbarano, Vitorchiano, Monticelli, Rispampano, and Civitavecchia. The state of affairs, however, came to an end when the Sicilian Vespers and the massacre of French knights by Guido of Montefeltro at Forlì in 1282 broke substantially Angevin power. Like, as you know, the Kingdom of Sicily was split in half. In the island proper, the Aragonese took over. And so a massive series of campaigns started to try to, to reconquer the island, but there were an enormous, loss of resources for Charles. That also had to lose to abandon his ambition to reconquer Constantinople, which is actually the reason why the Sicilian Vespers broke out. It was all a pretty well internationally organized uprising. So Angevin power shrank to the degree that Honorius IV and Nicholas IV followed the path again of their great predecessor, Innocent III, and the papal monarchy really affirmed herself further in Rome and the surroundings. And a bit the peak of this power, in an ideological sense, is represented by Boniface VIII, who was Bishop of Rome between 1294 and 1303. Now, people know Boniface VIII just for a fictionalized popular version of essentially a sort of a mix of stereotypes coming from Dante, from the anti-Catholic kind of Papist Black Legion, whatever. Boniface VIII, Benedetto Caetani, another Roman nobleman, was one of the single greatest rulers in the history of mankind, and people, of course, do not know anything about the reason why. If you still believe so, just know that you're basically being still obeying passively to the incredibly beautiful colonnades propaganda, and the popes had their own beautiful propaganda too, and whoever uses propaganda well, it's, can you blame them if other people actually believe that, right? And in any case, those were also standard political offenses, issues that were offenses that were really made to anyone at the time. If you know anything about late medieval politics, especially and Italian liberalistics, right? It's one of the single, again, most advanced political and juridical forms of misinformation, of fake news and so on, right? And something to be highly respected from the incredibly high civilizational level reached here. I mean, if you want to look at even just the artistic context of this, I made a video about the Italian Trecento that tells you literally what was happening between Florence, Rome, Naples, Avignon, etc. Because this is the cradle of it's the peak of the great medieval civilization, right? To a magnitudinal scale unprecedented in the history of mankind for the wealth of the local. And just properly the civilizational output in qualitative relative terms. Boniface VIII worked to build the papal state, right, in the name of the interests of this, and at the same time of his family, that, as we've seen, went in parallel. The Caetani came from the south of Rome and were, again, an incredibly powerful family. Boniface spared nothing to bring down militarily the strongest antagonists, the Ghibelline colonnas, whose stronghold of Palestrina was razed to the ground and salt thrown on the ashes by the Pope. I should make more videos about Boniface VIII. I think I made a couple of them back in the day, but it's really, again, one of the single greatest, most important and capable and incredible figures in medieval civilization. Boniface's policy is also very interesting because he used notoriously a lot of nepotism, which, however, was also paralleled by an open favor granted to the populace in the various, not in Rome, but in the various latial communes. So to basically try to weaken the nobility outside of Rome and the still keeping the commune under in Rome, right, and favoring this sort of lords, right, drawn from the same Caetani family, right. And this actually is an incredibly successful way of operating, right. The Pope invested really a lot for this. It was surely a good means of simplifying the government, also bringing together vast domains in a few hands. The problem with papal government, at least in terms of the continuity of the policy in the longer run, is, however, the fact that popes die and are, others from other factions are elected at the same point. With Clement V, at this point was an important presence of French men that, however, were not really making a French policy. They were making a papal policy. France was allied, but there was just a shared intent, right? Clement V, that ruled between 1305 and 1314, began the Avignonese papacy. Rome was maintained by the pontiffs as a proof of the position achieved locally, so that the Curia could simply move to France in this border areas, between the Holy Roman Empire and, in fact, the French kingdom, which, if you have been to Avignon, you know how beautiful the place really is, aside from the palace, which is fantastic, but just in the general landscape, the position on the Rhone, it's really, you understand why it was established there, and that remained until the French Revolution, a papal possession, just like Benevent. These were all kind of enclaves outside of the most contiguous compact papal states, but it was just part of the patrimonium. So this was no Avignonese captivity. As we were saying before, the French popes were making the Pope's interest. We're not making merely the French interest. The papal power was primary for obvious reason. It was really a solid one. And there were, of course, connections still with Italy that was ruled over, but the papal authority over the region, however, decreased. Right? The reason of the shift, the papal see from the papal curia, because of course the popes were bishops of Rome throughout the whole thing, right? So again, no cut, but it has to do with political reasons we can't simply summarize here, but the position of Avignon almost in the center of Europe, the general troubles that were occurring also in northern Italy, and there was a connection with southern France there, the Provençal power that was connected to this, right? So it was all a set of reasons that now we can't just simply digress on. Had a logic that was not merely, okay, let's abandon Rome, right? This was objectively the worst time in the Roman Middle Ages. The city had shrank to 30,000 inhabitants, that, however, at the time wasn't really small. So the myth that Rome became a simple place or sort of depopulated area is not entirely it, right? And telling the truth, there was even there, a political propaganda that wanted, for obvious reasons, also the papacy to come back to Rome, for other political reasons. Think about Petrarch, think about the connections here, we will see with Cola di Rienzo, with the Luxembourgs. I mean, now we can't simply, again, you understand what I'm saying, digressing so simply. But it was emphasized as if, oh my God, Rome has become a brothel, and plus, centuries later, tons of Protestant propaganda about this terrible, rotten, corrupt Roman Church and all this terrible thing. That's not really what occurred, right? Of course, it's difficult if you've never heard these things to simply, okay, I believe you, but just know that I come from somewhere, and with this stuff, and I don't kid with it either, so I know what I'm talking about. But generally speaking, there's a lot of hypocrisy in the way history is told for obvious reasons, and I try to make say the most objective history that I can in many ways, and you need to counter certain prejudices in the first place, as hard as they are. Surely there was a process of internal fragmentation of, generally speaking, the Curia, as we've seen, had attracted really lots of artists, of craftsmen, of people who just had to provide to the households of the cardinals, that were incredibly powerful and rich and paid well. So Rome was left a bit in the hands of the say unruly baronial aristocracy. There was still a community. There was still properly a local organization, militia. There are lots of things happening. During this period, there is the largest urban battle fought in the Middle Ages in Rome in 1312 at the time of Henry VII. The Roman populace was mostly at this point capable of defending herself rather than counter the predominance of the Colonnas and the Orsinis that sided either the emperor or in fact the French, the Angevins, the papacy. There was surely an economic crisis. The passage of Henry VII, the one of Louis of Bavaria, were true military expeditions with clashes. The German forces of the Wittelsbach had to abandon Rome with a tumultuous Roman people that was killing the Germans and throwing them in the river, things like that. So there weren't really easy times just per se, but they tell you still paradoxically the livelihood of this city, right? There was a lot of cattle farming around Rome. The salt mines, let's say the salt collection from the mouth of the river. There was a fish economy, right? Interestingly enough, it's all a world mostly to study archaeologically, to understand even how the city was really at the time. It was extremely compact. The Colonnas and the Orsinis had fortified the entire freaking place, right? And there were literally massive systems of castles, walls, etc. within the same city. Entire quarters were fortified, so it's to be impregnable, or almost, right, from enemy assaults. So there are literally tons and tons of videos we could make about it if we were to enter in the details of that specific urban/siege warfare. The Roman people missed the papacy by this point, admittedly, in spite of all the struggles. They wished for the return, especially of Pope John the 22nd. The crucial years were 1326, 1329. And there were successful attempts to defend the city also from an Angevin control. Sciarra Colonna, for example, defeated the Angevin army at some point within the city. They let them in, and they defeated them within the city walls as a sort of trap. There is a lot of this history. Lazio's territory at some point was ravaged by the German mercenaries of Ludwig the Bavarian, some of them succeeding to the papacy. John the 22nd was like a great political player. He spent millions of florins to fight against the Visconti in the north, trying to establish a papal state in the Po Valley, but the thing failed. From that point onwards, especially with that of John the 22nd, the Neapolitan King Robert, the famous King Robert, there is a general contraction of the entire Europe right, we're in the 30s, the 40s of the 14th century, realized that resources properly run out. This is the moment in which even the soldiers of fortune appear. There are the Gascon troops that support the French rectors in Rome that really mismanage things pretty badly. This brought to, by the way, a harsh papal reproaching of these actions, right? The provincial indignation against this rule that was felt like just they were simply subcontracted the rule of the Latial provinces for just squeezing down nothing else. The political discontent mounts against the state of affairs. This is very felt at the time of Benedict XII, who ruled between 1334 and 1342. The shrinking of Angevin power has basically evidence that Rome must rely on herself, or at least on a functional papal government to call back at some point, rather than relying on forces that do not arrive anymore. The Angevins had traditionally backed the Guelph Italy with the aforementioned garrisons or reinforcements. At this point, Naples is also engulfed in a civil war, dynastic war, turning civil on its own. So the situation is really delicate. There are mercenary bands roaming the peninsula, admittedly used by the local powers, not really just walking by themselves. But it's one of those situations where, the lack of a direct, of a functional government can be very, very dangerous. The result is the strengthening of the popular party, so the instances of the people, as it's demonstrated by the senatorial election of Tebaldo of St. Eustache and Martino Stefaneschi. The Pope was now the only one capable of restoring order to Rome, and from the urbs to the entire Lazio. Given that the centrality of Rome, of course, had not come less, and also in the region, like, people understood that the return of the papal return to Rome would have solved also part of their instability. With Pope Clement VI, these are all Avignonese popes, right? So in 1342 to 1352, the Roman noblemen suffered the suppression of the Senate and the government of the 13th. Cola di Rienzo in this attempted to essentially at some point being supported by the populace, at times by the noblemen. The sense was restoring a sort of Roman republic of some sort, and reforming the entire system. But the mistake was mostly pushing too much against the nobility, right? That indeed was weakened at that point, right? There was at least a moment of generalized instability also, like throughout all over Europe, where you had these popular uprisings a bit everywhere, and the nobility was legitimately scared, but they would win the war, as we've seen with the Jacquerie later on, also with, especially in the north of Central Europe. That happened a bit later in the early 15th century, but it's the same wave in part with what Tyler, John Ball, the Hussites, and so on. But at this point was the actual chance of the commoners managing to oust the nobility would pass through blood, right? The fate of this decision, right? the papacy was truly the only one that would have benefited from the edict of restitution of sovereign rights to Rome, right, by which the lands of Campania and Marittima, of Sabina and the Roman Tuscia would recognize themselves as vassals of the city, right? So Cola di Rienzi's attempt was as, flamboyant, as tragic as but there was something there. There was a reforming of the Roman militia, a sense of the power of infantry per se. But this was also a time of generalized crisis for which all these attempts were desperate and bold, and as such also very risky. Reason for which fixing the situation in Rome was not just enough per se, right? The control of the surrounding lands, especially the closest ones to Rome, of course, but also this broader dimension of the Papal States as it had been affirming itself in central and partly also northern Italy, was crucial in insight. And the work of Aegidius Albornoz in Sabina and Tuscia was the logical consequence of these events. This was a papal vicar. He was a Spanish bishop. We've seen him also at the Battle of Rio Salado. And he was sent to essentially bring order in all these regions. There were some inquiries made by the papal agents asking local clergymen, etc., what would have been the best way to bring order locally. And there was a Marquesan clergyman who said something like, for the marches at least, I think 500 knights should suffice. And this is, or 300, I don't remember, but in that order, right, to say that's how it works, right? You cannot take over the land if you do not invest military power, men-at-arms, and so on. So Aegidius Albornoz worked generally to reorganize the papal administration in these lands. It was done still very medievally, that is ad hoc, commune by commune. This was normally done by supporting mostly the popular party of the cities to just reduce the power of the local lords, thus excluding the local nobility from the offices of the regime. This wouldn't be entirely successful in perspective, because still the Papal States especially would remain very feudal in nature, right? Especially the Apennine, but the papal nobility, the Roman nobility in general, was the most warlike in Italy. If the Papal States had been politically unified early on, this had the largest military potential in the peninsula, notoriously. If you look at the greatest commanders of the time, they were all from these places historically. There were many, not just the Colonnas, the Orsinis for Rome, but there were the Montefeltro, there were really other very, very tough guys, but they preferred, naturally, as long as papal authority was weak, just to have their own seigneury in loco and not really, giving too much power away like that. But gradually they were co-opted by the Papal States, so that they would be in favor, confirmed in their own possessions when they had become really very, very powerful. Right here we're talking mostly about Lazio, that had not seen that historically, because yes, there were these powerful Roman families, but we have seen how the papal monarchy had been able to bring them down. If we talk about the Montefeltro from the other side of the Apennines in northern Italy, it was another story. All right, those were admittedly another thing. I made a video about medieval Perugia, that is actually the most important city after Rome in the Papal States, and that showed you how things worked, at least in that case, in the Umbrian interland within the mountains. So When Rome, however, found herself at the center of a network which administratively gave her the reins of the entire region, the people and the nobility had, by fighting, essentially exhausted their own forces. They basically made the best possible condition for the popes to reinstall their own power in the city. Right. This was understood, of course, by the pontiff that returned finally, surrounded by the favor of all of Italy, that was asking insistently, of course, for such a prestigious, arguably at that point the most prestigious institution, to come back to Rome, which occurred in 1377. Right. So this opened a new phase of papal history that would mostly take off in the beginning of the 15th century, a delay due to the crisis that occurred with the Western Schism, that for years undermined, generally speaking, also the prestige of the papacy, in the sense that, of course, at some point there were 3 different popes at the same time. A couple of them were anti-popes. That's also another very complex chapter that I think, horrendously enough, we never treated on Schwerpunkt. We have to make up for it, because, for a medieval history-based channel, I think it's scandalous, to say the least. In any case, as you know, the papal monarchy was not demolished by this crisis, and the institution remained as the empire at the time. They still existed, they were still prestigious, and they all, as we were saying before, restarted also from, even though weakened as universal powers, for stronger local bases. And definitely the papal one was Lazio, right? There was a help from Naples in the re-establishment, say, of the papal dominion. Namely, King Ladislaus was enough for Boniface IX to suppress the rebellions that were agitating Lazio. The provisions of 1398 ousted the guilds and placed the foreign senator of Rome and the 3 so-called preservers, let's put it in this way, of the civic chamber of the urbs in the government. The victory of Onorato, that was the Count of Fondi, lord of the Campagna Marittima in 1399, was another event. There was an armistice requested by John of Vico in 1399. The Pope waged another crusade against the Colonna that brought to the submission of the latter. Viterbo was subjugated again. Right. Finally, the favor of the Orsini and the Caetani and the power created for their grandchildren showed that the Pope was really the strongest, and the only one capable of, at this point, giving that stability, offering those paths of career promotion that would have made these families throw in the towel as far as, kind of disgregated ambitions would do. There were still messed up years in which it was the King of Naples now that took advantage of the situation. We're talking about the pontificate of Innocent VII between 1404 and 1406, the one of Gregory XII in 1406, 1417, right? But if the lands of Lazio were always linked to the strongest and allowed Ladislaus' troops to enter the patrimony of St. Peter. Equally, they showed themselves, this lands showed themselves compliant towards Alexander V, who was Pope between 1409 and 1410, when he restored power in the region, supported by essentially a federal army from the faithful, right? As a consequence, this was mostly played in the north. Actually, Viterbo, Montefiascone, and Corneto quickly surrendered to the papal forces as well. So they're really confused years. I'm making it all very simple. As you understand, we can't deal with everything in detail, but the thing you really have to remember is the pontificate of Martin V, because from this moment onwards, what you know as the papal state, right, Renaissance Rome, really begins in many ways, politically, but also with the final pacification of Lazio, and or at least there would be still struggles, but in fact, especially at this point, it was a matter of mercenaries, right, that would be hired as entire companies and making the difference. This is the famous condottieri, right? But under Martin V, there is a final papal victory. He was pontiff between 1417 and 1431. He started embellishing Rome as all the other popes would along the Renaissance pattern. At this point, the papal forces were embodied by the Vitelleschi and the Scarampo families of condottieri, right? The prefect of Vico, who resided in a town known as Vetralla, was the first to pay with death for the long rebellions of his family, of the prefects of Vico. In fact, it died out with him, right? Antonio of Pontedera was defeated at Piperno and then executed. Piperno, some of these towns changed name, like in contemporary times, but they're the same places, really. The Colonnas saw their essentially final forfeiture in the properties of Palestrina, Zagarolo, Gallicano, Castelnuovo, Civitalavigne, San Giorgio, Passerano, and San Pietro in Formis. This regularized really the pontiff's territorial control much. Nicholas V, 1447, 1455, and Pius II, the famous, Piccolomini, 1458, 1464, the one of John Hunyadi and John of Capistrano, the crusade against the Turks, the siege of Belgrade, and so on, crowned the work, so much so they invested themselves also in the this is the age of signories. There would be much to say about that, but at least the fact that even an energetic effort against the Ottomans was now being resumed at Belgrade. After Belgrade, if it hadn't been for the plague and the death of everyone involved among these characters, the Westerners could push on Constantinople and retake it from the Turks, notoriously. But again, things went differently. Pius II subjected Sabina, thanks especially to the support of the famous condottiere Federico da Montefeltro. I made a video about the Battle of Molinella that was fought just slightly later where Frederick was present against the famous Colleoni, the Venetian condottiere. But in Pius II times, Sabina was seized again with the capitulation of Palombara, was the most important center, and the decline of important lineages such as the Sabelli, that, as we've seen, have been at a point even already against the Pope. The papal forces dislodged the condottieri, the Piccinina, the Sforza, respectively, by the other condottieri Alessandro Mirabelli and the aforementioned Federico da Montefeltro. And you can argue that with the victory of Paul II, Pope, between 1464 and 1471 over the Anguillara family, the Church of Rome became mistress of the entire Patrimonium Sancti Petri. This naturally should be seen always in perspective, with a grain of salt, because problems in medieval times and early modern times were never that easily over. The papal states were yet to be compacted effectively, but you realize that just see the Montefeltro here, they get their of course their role in the papal states strengthened by helping the same papacy in the diametrically opposite location within the same states, and so this was a way of co-opting them for the popes that at this point could at least freely base themselves on this glacial power, from which they could really start eating up basically all the rest of the papal states. But the political situation in Italy and abroad was so unstable that you cannot say, so they did bad. No, because nobody would know what would happen, right? The Ottomans from one side, the French that are basically expanding now in other places in the expectation of doing it in Italy, the Aragonese who sees Naples. There is really a lot of the Venetians that attempt to take over the entire central northern Italy. I mean, there is everything could happen, right? So they had all their very logical reasons for doing exactly what they were doing. And I'm just frustrated that we have to at least for now still introduce so much still, when of course there is much more incomparably to say about all these things if we actually look at them individually. So we will hopefully do it at some point, but it's really hard. Just I'm glad to address these topics, because I have the impression again that, generally speaking, people do not know them. At least the type of history that I make, I don't see being made anywhere on YouTube, and perhaps it's also the reason why I don't get enough views compared to all the work I do, and definitely the success of other channels. But I feel that these are more important than the average that is said here, right? So I say it without modesty, telling the truth, because the topics are really interesting and they deserve, but I realize that the more I make reference to complex history and the least people properly have the tools to refer to it, it's actually a huge problem. And this seems like unfortunate enough, as you understand, to the point that, however, pushes me to say, consider to keep talking about this stuff, because without it, where's the fun, right? I could make junky animations to hope to get more views or something, but no, I prefer to talk about history. This is what I do, aside from, say, what I research on, and I believe that at least if even just one of you gets the point that I made, finally everything has been worth it. We will keep talking still about the Papal States. There is really a lot to say about them. I think I made many videos about the Papal States, but comprehensively like this, very few. Once this was not even about the Papal States, even though it ends up being. We considered the Roman commune, we considered the Roman nobility in the other towns around Rome. But it never ends here, right? So you have plenty of other videos that I normally put you now under the, in the top fixed comment, so that you can look at the various. There's a video made last year about 15th century papal power, which I think is quite interesting because it makes you picture the extent of how powerful the Roman Church was by this point. Just by internal organization, by, as we were saying before, juridical production, civilizational output. But it's really, really interesting, right, if you study it in depth. Because otherwise, everything remains faceless, right, and unfunny in that regard. Okay, for today, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.